Nice. 39 and 83 hundredths. Dear Tim and Moby, can you make a movie about decimals? From Veronica. Sure can. Basically, a decimal is a number that's based on the number 10. Actually, all of our numbers are decimals because our number system is based on 10. Even the word decimal comes from the Latin word for 10, decim. But usually, when people talk about decimals, they're talking about numbers that are only parts of a whole. Imagine you've got a rectangle that represents one whole object. If you divide it into 10 smaller equal-sized rectangles, you now have 10 parts of one, tenths. If you divide each of those into 10 smaller rectangles, you have 10 times 10, or 100 parts of one, hundredths. Now, if you divide each of those into 10 smaller rectangles, you have 10 times 100, or 1,000 parts of one, thousandths. All of these fractions, tenths, hundredths, and thousands, are called decimal units. Well, writing decimals is pretty easy. In our number system, I can count from 0 to 9 in the units place. To count bigger numbers, I have to move left, over to the tens place. Each place increases by a power of 10. Because decimal units are smaller than 1 unit, you actually move to the right of the units place. To do that, you need this guy, the decimal point. Numbers to the left of the decimal point are whole numbers, and numbers to the right are decimals. Except for the units, every place on the left side has a decimal equivalent on the right. Tens and tenths, hundreds and hundredths, thousands and thousandths. So this number is 39 and 83 hundredths. Actually, decimals are really important. We use them every day to talk about money. Right, 1 cent is just 1/100th of a dollar. We can also use decimals for weight, measuring distances, baseball statistics, temperatures, and even stock prices. You need more reasons? Well, arithmetic is a lot easier with decimals than it is with fractions. As long as you line the decimal points up, you can add or subtract them just like whole numbers. Also, decimal numbers are easy to compare. By adding zeros to the right of the shorter number to make the numbers the same length, you can tell right away which one is bigger. Well, 0 is just a placeholder. Adding zeros to the right of a decimal number doesn't change the value of the number.
Okay guys, today we are going to cover the place value of decimal numbers. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, what is a decimal? A decimal is a dot that falls between a whole number and a fractional part. So if I have this number right here, this now becomes a decimal number because I added a decimal into it. Now, what we're going to talk about today is how to read those decimal numbers. In our last lesson, we talked about how to read the whole numbers. So let's talk about decimal numbers. When you're dealing with the decimal, in 5th grade, we have 3 spots that fall after that decimal. What we need to do is we need to learn the names of those 3 spots. So, the name of the first spot is the tenths. The name of the second spot is the hundredths. And the name of the third spot is the thousandths. If you noticed, when I said and wrote all of these, they all end in a THS. That's how you know that it is a decimal word. So if you are talking about a decimal number, you must say the tenths, the hundredths, or the thousandths. So, when we talked about reading whole numbers, we said that whenever you got to a comma, you had to read the last name of every single family. Well, decimals are kind of the same way. If I were to write this decimal 386, how would I read that? Well, the first thing you do is you look at the entire number that comes after the decimal. The entire number that comes after the decimal is 386. So I say 386, and then I look at the spot that 386 falls in. That 6 falls in the thousandths. So the way I would read that would be 386 thousandths. If I was to take that 6 off, I now see that my decimal number stops in what place value? It stops in the hundredths. So if I were to read that number, it would be 38 hundredths. And if I were to take away that 8, and now I notice that I only fill up to the tenths spot. So when reading that decimal, that would be 3 tenths. Now, what do we do when we throw a whole number in the mix with the decimal? So if I had the number right here, if I had that number, well, you read it. You read the first number first. You read the whole number first. That number is 12. Whenever you get to a decimal, you say and. You have to say the word and whenever you get to a decimal. So I would read this as 12 and 304 thousandths, because it falls in the thousandths place value. If I took that 3 out and put a 0 there, and I were to read this number, it would be 12 and then I look at that number after the decimal. The number after the decimal is a 4, and it lands in the thousandths. So it's 12 and 4 thousandths. Now, another way to remember which place value is which, because sometimes it becomes a little difficult to remember that the first one is the tenths, the second one is the hundredths, and the third one is the thousandths. And I learned a great thing that Schultz Junior High is going to teach, and that is to say that whenever you get to a decimal, you have a decimal and you have those 3 spots after. An easy way to remember it, let me write that again, decimal and 3 spots after, is when you get to a decimal, you hit it and you say, boom, Tom heard thunder. So if you were trying to remember what place value it was, you would say, boom, Tom heard thunder. And when you see those, the reason it's Tom heard thunder is because the T in Tom stands for the tenths, the H in heard stands for the hundredths, and the TH in thunder stands for the thousandths. So that will hopefully help you recognize the number a little more. So let's do one more example. Let's do 3, 4, 8, 6. So if I were to read this number, I read the whole number first. My whole number is 3,486. I read the decimal as and then I read this entire number at the end. That entire number is 21. Now that 21 falls in 1, 2, 3 spots. So if I do my boom, Tom heard thunder, I know that that 1 stops in the thousandths. So that is 3,486 and 21 thousandths. Let's do one more. How would I read this number? I would read it as 604 tenths, because there's only 1 spot after the decimal that it fills up. And I say, boom, Tom. Well, the T stands for tenths. So it is 604 tenths. The only other thing you're going to need to be able to do is if you're given a number like this, and they ask you the value of the 8, you have to be able to identify certain place values of your decimal numbers. So if we were to identify the value of the 8, we would say that that 8 is is not 8 tenths, it is 8 hundredths. Because when I look at my decimal, I have boom, Tom heard. That 8 falls in the heard, so it would be 8 hundredths.